before I get into the definition of what ethical hacking is, one thing I want to mention that I do from an organization perspective, half of my job is being the bad guy, and the other half of my job is trying to find the bad guy. So it's a lot of fun, and I get to see both sides of the fence. And I think that's actually pretty important when it comes to either being an ethical hacker or even from a defense perspective, because you get to learn new techniques on both sides, how to detect things, and then more advanced techniques in terms of how to stay hidden and how to bypass security controls. So what is ethical hacking? Ethical hacking refers to the act of locating weaknesses and vulnerabilities of computer and information systems by duplicating the intent and actions of malicious hackers. Ethical hacking is also known as penetration testing, intrusion testing, or red teaming. And I actually take issue with the term red teaming because ex-military, it's actually red team, but I'll let it go. An ethical hacker operates with the knowledge and permission of an organization for which they are trying to defend. Now, I think the key points here is that we duplicate the intent and actions of a malicious actor. We are not a malicious actor. And the other key point is that we operate with the permission of the organization which they are trying to defend. I think that's two very important things when it comes to ethical hacking. So from a concept perspective, Lockheed Martin put together anatomy of an attack, what they call their cyber kill chain. So this is what the bad guys do, and it actually closely resembles a lot of penetration testing methodology as well. So the first thing they do is they do a reconnaissance. They try to get as much information as possible, right? The next phase is they weaponize their information. And they go from there into identify potential exploitation vectors. They exploit that, they pivot, and they exfiltrate information, or in what they call action on objectives. I apologize, it's a little small on my screen right now. So what action on objective means that they are fulfilling their objective. Now, oftentimes, this could be exfiltrating data, like hospital records or that sort of thing. Other times, it could also mean launching a ransomware attack. So we'll discuss a little bit about some of the things that we see a lot right now is a rise in Emotet and TrickBot dropping Ryuk ransomware in organizations. And these are more or less targeted events that we see. So common breach scenarios. Credential harvesting. How many people here have had their credentials harvested that's willing to admit it? So all of these screens that you see on the, well, not anymore. All of these screenshots that you see here are actually taken from campaigns, and they look very similar to the actual Google login or actual Office 365 login. So these can be very deceptive, right? It's probably, you know, the least interesting sort of technique, but it can be the most detrimental to some organizations. So 96% of breaches are still via email and through phishing techniques like this, credential harvesting. One scenario that we were doing an investigation on, they targeted an individual with financial authority. They sent out the campaign. He entered his credentials in. They used those credentials almost instantaneously to create a forward rule in the mailbox. They forwarded the emails to an external email address, and they monitored the traffic. And then at the end of the month, when it was invoicing time, they sent out, the individual sent out, you know, to all of his clients, you know, please pay your invoice of X amount. They were monitoring the traffic back and forth, and then they spoofed an email. And they said, for that invoice I just sent you, please update the banking information to the following. What do you think happened? They entered the bank, they updated the banking information, $500,000. Just like that. So it's something that you need to be aware of. From an attack perspective, from a user education perspective, but also some technical controls to prevent this from happening. So can anybody think of something or technical control that would have been in place that could have protected or stopped this from happening? Two-factor authentication, yeah. Yeah. Another technique is malicious documents being sent. So these will contain macros in them that will also execute obfuscated code. After the initial execution, it will generally download additional payload to do the objective, whether it's remote access, persistence, data exfiltration. Pro tip, has anybody analyzed a document before statically? You know that they're a zip file. If you rename the extension docx to zip, you can uncompress it and do a static analysis of it. So you can extract the macro in there without having to execute it on your machine. So then they attempt to try some form of persistence. And so some of these techniques, in this instance here, we have an example of a scheduled task. So this will download a PowerShell script at a given time and date. So this is important because you may take a look, you may scan it with your malware bytes, and say you've removed the malware, but this scheduled task stays there. And so what ends up happening is it'll run again, download the payload, and then reassert itself. Other methods of persistence are things like auto runs, startup folder. You can do service replacement, DLL search order hijacking, which is a little bit more advanced, probably a little bit beyond the scope from a talk perspective. But these are just different mechanisms that you can use to maintain persistence on a machine. Then we get to exfiltration. Now, this is kind of cool. So this is an example of TrickBot. It's a PCAP Wireshark. And you can see here what's being exfiltrated. Temporal is a username and password. So after initial infection, what this does is it deploys, sits there and monitors, and starts exfiltrating credentials externally. Right? This is before they drop the ransomware. And then, of course, the ransomware. Now, I have to admit, these screenshots I actually pulled from the internet. They're not things that we analyze, because the stuff that we analyze doesn't look this sexy. It's tends to be just a text document on the desktop that says, here's how you pay from a Bitcoin perspective, or here's how you get in contact with us, what we see in targeted attacks. They'll actually have an email address and say, we want to correspond with you back and forth in order to pay that. Our latest investigation, the target demand was $1.2 million Canadian funds converted to Bitcoin. So there's a real financial impact to ransomware now. It's not just drive-bys that are happening where people are clicking on links and it's encrypting an individual desktop. This will actually proliferate through the entire environment using things like Samba version 1 to exploit machines across the way. And they'll use this or the TrickBot to actually remove backups. So it's quite devastating. So how can ethical hacking help? Well, ethical hacking can help identify vulnerabilities or weakness in your security before the threat actors are able to see them, right? Ethical hacking can help identify the impact of those vulnerabilities or weaknesses. Ethical hacking can keep security top of mind. So you can use it as an awareness training type of platform. So, you know, if somebody is a byproduct of a social engineering attack within your organization, it's much better to come from an IT department to keep it top of mind that I should watch what I click, as opposed to being caught by a threat actor. Ethical hacking can also identify blind spots in your defenses, in your blue team, right? So detection capabilities, are they up to par, right? And it's a one-team kind of a thing. Offensive security should be, and ethical hacking should be in partnership with your blue team and your defensive capabilities, right? It shouldn't be two separate entities trying to do better than each other, right? At the end of the day, we need to learn from each other to move forward. So I have probably about a little better than 10 minutes left. I'm going to teach you all to be hackers. Sound good? Okay. Lee's cringing right now. So there are a lot of tools that are available online that allow you to sort of test your defenses internally. Now, make sure you get permission first, and I would recommend playing with this in a lab-type environment before you start progressing and moving towards a production environment, because there are side effects that can happen. You can crash services and that sort of thing, which wouldn't be very, your IT department might not like that very much. So the first thing you need is some form of VirtualBox VMware, a hypervisor of some sort. And this allows you to deploy a tool or a distribution called Kali Linux. Kali Linux is a decent distribution because it has all of the tools necessary to do these types of assessment all in one box. So you don't have to keep installing stuff over and over again. It is Linux, so it does help if you have a little bit of Linux knowledge in order to use some of these tools. Some of the alternatives for Kali, there's also, and I know I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, so forgive me. There's also Parrot OS or Backbox. So there's a number of different distributions that you can use. So scenario 1, credential harvesting. There's a couple of online resources that are outside of the Linux distribution that you can have access to. One is Have I Been Pawned? This will identify, so one of the things that, from a credential harvest perspective, there's two ways that you can get credentials. One is you can actively harvest them by sending out a phishing link and saying, hey, please click on this and enter in your username and password. The other way is more passive, where they buy lists online, and you can get these data dumps, and because of password reuse, chances are the same password that somebody used on their LinkedIn is the same password that they used on their corporate network. That's a good thing, right? No. Well, good thing depending on which side of the fence you're on at the time. There's also another service called thehash.com, and this is where we get into, this is a bit of a gray area from an ethics perspective, because you can pay for about $5 and you can get those data dumps and the passwords that have been extracted from those hash dumps. So, bad guys are obviously using this. If the fact that you're using it, again, it's on the balance of from an ethics perspective. So the first toolkit on Kali is something called the Social Engineering Toolkit. This is an open source penetration testing framework. It was designed by David Kennedy, who at DerbyCon. Anybody go to DerbyCon or have been at DerbyCon? Yeah, okay. But basically, this has got a lot of resources available for exactly that, social engineering. It's actually very menu-driven, too. So you just select specific numbers that you want to do. In this case, we want to run the command using set toolkit. We select social engineering attacks. Then we select credential harvesting. And then there's an option to clone the web page. All you have to do is point the URL, and there you go. Now it's cloned on your local box, and it's sitting there listening for anybody to enter in their credentials. Now, how well does this work? Which one's the real one, and which one's the fake one? Yeah, you can tell because of the URL on the top. But there are techniques that you can use to hide the URL in an email so that when they click it and they open it up, they're not necessarily thinking, they go forward and they enter in their username and password, and then you have it into your, saved on your machine, and you can use that to launch a secondary attack. Again, mitigation strategy here is to make sure you use 2FA, also user education. One on a side note for user education, everybody says that that's the be-all and end-all, that makes sure that it's top of mind, but I got to tell you, there's some links when I get email that I'm looking at that I have to look 3, 4, 5 times, and I'm thinking, I'm not even sure if this is real or not. I gotta actually pick up a phone and call and say, did you really send me that email? Yeah, I sent. Okay. So sometimes even the best of us, it gets you. So I say user education is a caveat. Get it definitely from a low-hanging fruit perspective, but it's not just the only line of defense. So scenario 2, malicious documents. So there's a toolkit, Metasploit. How many people have heard of Metasploit? How many people have used Metasploit? You're all experts? Okay, excellent. So I won't get too much into specifically the Metasploit itself, but you can use this to generate VBA code. And that Visual Basic code you can take and you can put inside a Word document as a macro. So all I've done is I've set my local host, I've set my local port on 443 because, of course, most firewalls allow 443 out. And then I've just set it to force generate in a Visual Basic capacity. I just copy paste that into a Word document. It looks like a Word document. And actually, I did this earlier and I was surprised because it ran on Windows 10 and didn't give me any warnings. So that was, you know, good stuff. So now I have remote shell. And you can see in the window there, I actually did a PS and I could list all the processes that are running on that environment. So now I can pretty much do anything with the equivalent privileges of that user. Can anybody think of a mitigation strategy here to prevent me from being able to potentially go further? Yeah? Disable macros, yeah. But I can guarantee, depending on where you are from an operations perspective, that there are a lot of organizations that rely heavily on being able to use macros within an environment. Can anybody think of something else? Sorry, I can't. Is there no more hands up? Sure.
You can run it in a sandbox and take screenshots and deliver just the screenshots of the document
instead of what's in it. You could do. Where I was kind of going with it a little bit is limit the permissions of the user, right? Because if you limit the user permissions, it limits the amount of stuff that you can do or execute as that user, right? Because then we get to the next step, which is Mimikatz. So now I can launch Mimikatz in an environment, and Mimikatz is a tool that allows me to extract passwords from that machine. So when I launch that, why would I need more passwords? I've done my harvest credentials, right? I've gotten all the passwords for the user. I've got them to click on the document. I'm sitting on their box. Why would I need more passwords? Yeah. Domain admin, right? So a lot of times Windows caches those passwords on the machine, and so it becomes relatively easy using tools like Mimikatz to start extracting those passwords and elevating your privilege, right? And then basically establishing additional persistence. So then we get to the final scenario, and this is where we get into persistence, command execution, and ransomware. So how do we test or simulate a ransomware attack? We don't really want to go executing ransomware in the environment. That wouldn't necessarily be considered ethical, I don't think. But you can demonstrate that if you had the capabilities to execute something within that environment, that you would also be susceptible to something like ransomware. So from here, you can see there's a whole bunch of modules that are available within PowerShell Empire to create persistence. A lot of this similar to techniques that are used by attackers, modifying registry keys for persistence, putting in something in auto run or in a startup script, so that every time it boots up, it'll connect back to your command and control box and give you the capability to continue to have access within that environment, right? So essentially, from an ethical hacking perspective, if you have ethical hackers do an assessment in your environment, they could potentially identify security weaknesses in your organization. This is where I also want to stress the balance between understanding defense as well as attacking, because if you understand real world attacks and you're an analyst and you understand how these attacks are coming in, that's beneficial to implement as an attacker as well, because you can use those same techniques. So there's an investigation that I was on, and I'm just going to get a little bit technical, but there was a PowerShell encoding string that was used, which seems pretty standard. But what they did is they used Unicode and a mod 256 to convert it back to ASCII. So if you can think from a signature perspective how difficult that would be, because there's, I think there's something like 2,000 potential different representations of the letter A. So you can, when you try to convert that back, it becomes very difficult to detect or create signatures for. So when I saw that technique, I thought, that's brilliant. I want to use that. So you know, you can kind of learn from both sides of the fence. Then I guess the final thing that I would also like to sort of say is, you know, these tools can be fun to play with in a lab, but as I said, don't try to do it in production, and especially not if you don't have permission. So any questions?